labelled as being a drink or towards the latter end of sweet, and that was...
In the kaleidoscope of the 1970s glam rock scene, few names shone brighter than Brian Connolly. His voice, powerful, smooth, and instantly recognizable, carried songs that didn't just top charts, they defined an entire era. From Ballroom Blitz to Fox on the Run, he wasn't just the frontman of Sweet, he was the core frequency that held everything together. On stage, under blinding lights and shimmering costumes, he looked untouchable, like nothing could go wrong. But behind that image, something else was forming. Something slower, heavier, and impossible to ignore once it started. Because what people saw was the peak. What they didn't see was the cost of staying there. And before we go deeper into what really happened behind the rise and the fall, take a second, like, share, and subscribe, because stories like this don't just show fame, they show what it does to the person carrying it. Brian's story didn't begin with music, it began with absence. Born in Hamilton, Scotland in 1945, his life started without a clear foundation. His mother left him shortly after birth. His father was never identified. That kind of beginning doesn't just disappear, it becomes part of how you see yourself, even if you don't fully understand it yet. He was adopted into a working-class family and grew up as Brian McManus, living what looked like a normal life. Football, school, dreams of becoming an engineer. On the surface, everything was stable, but stability built on incomplete information has a limit. At 18, he discovered the truth that he had been adopted. And that moment didn't just change his past, it changed his identity. Imagine building your entire sense of self on one version of reality, and then suddenly finding out it wasn't complete. That kind of realization creates a fracture, not visible from the outside, but strong enough to shift everything internally. That's when he chose to reclaim his birth name, Connolly, not because it solved anything, but because it gave him a connection to something unknown, a starting point, even if the rest of the story was missing. From there, music became more than just interest, it became direction. He joined bands, performed locally, and slowly built his presence. But what made him stand out wasn't just his voice, it was how he delivered it. There was emotion behind it, a kind of intensity that felt real, not rehearsed. When he joined Wainwright's Gentlemen and later connected with Mick Tucker, something clicked, not just musically, but structurally. They understood each other's rhythm, and that kind of alignment is rare. In 1968, that alignment turned into something bigger, the formation of Sweet. At first, nothing exploded immediately. Early singles didn't make much impact. The growth was slow. But once they connected with songwriters Nicky Chinn and Mike Chapman, everything changed. Hits followed, recognition followed, momentum built rapidly. And this is where the curve sharply rises. By the early 1970s, Sweet weren't just successful, they were everywhere. Their sound, their image, their energy, it all connected with a generation that wanted something louder, brighter, more expressive. And Brian stood at the center of it all. But here's the part people often miss. Rapid success doesn't just increase opportunities, it increases pressure at the same rate. Behind the scenes, tensions were already forming. The band didn't fully agree with the direction they were being pushed toward. The bubblegum pop image brought success, but it didn't match how they saw themselves as musicians. That disconnect matters, because when identity and output don't align, something eventually breaks. They tried to fix it by writing their own music, moving toward a heavier sound. Albums like Sweet Fanny Adams showed what they were really capable of. But just as things were shifting creatively, everything changed physically. The attack. A single night, a single moment, and everything that defined him, his voice, was permanently damaged. Think about that. For a singer, your voice isn't just a tool, it's your entire system, your identity, your connection to everything you've built. And suddenly, it wasn't the same anymore. The band tried to continue, adjusting roles, sharing vocals, moving forward. But something essential had been lost. And once that core element changes, everything built around it starts to shift too. By the late 1970s, the cracks were visible. Brian's confidence dropped, his health declined. alcohol became more present in his life, not as a choice, but as a response. And this is where the downward curve begins. Not instantly, not dramatically, but steadily. The 1978 performance where he collapsed on stage wasn't just a bad night, it was a signal. A moment where everything that had been building internally finally became visible externally. Soon after, he left Sweet. Officially, it was to pursue a solo career, but in reality, it was the result of everything that had already been happening. After that, his life didn't stabilize, it fragmented. He tried to rebuild, new music, new bands, touring. And in places like Germany, fans still showed up, still believed, still connected with what he once was. But success wasn't the same anymore. Back in the UK, financial problems appeared. Tax issues, loss of property, isolation. And this is where the contrast becomes clear. On one side, a man who once stood at the center of one of the biggest bands in the world. On the other, someone struggling to maintain even a basic level of stability. Yet even then, he didn't stop performing. Because for him, music wasn't just a career, it was the only constant he had left. In the 1990s, there was one final attempt, an album, a new beginning, a chance to reconnect with something meaningful. And for a brief moment, something positive returned. He found love again, built a family, reconnected with his biological roots. That part matters, because even after everything, fame, loss, failure, he still found pieces of himself he had been searching for since childhood. But time had already taken too much. His health continued to decline. And by the mid-90s, the effects of years of damage were impossible to ignore. The documentary Don't Leave Me This Way showed a version of Brian that most fans weren't prepared to see. Not the performer, not the icon, but the person. Fragile, struggling, yet still holding on to something inside that refused to disappear. His final performance in 1996 wasn't just a concert, it was the final point on a long curve that had risen higher than most expected and fallen harder than many expected. In 1997, he passed away at 51. And when you look at his life as a whole, it doesn't follow a simple story of success or failure. It looks like a complete system. Early instability, discovery of talent, rapid rise, external control versus internal identity conflict, a breaking point, and then a long, complex attempt to rebuild something that could never fully return to what it was. But here's what makes his story stay relevant. The music didn't fade. The voice, damaged as it became, still exists in recordings that continue to connect with people decades later. Songs like Ballroom Blitz aren't just nostalgic, they're evidence, proof of what he was capable of at his peak. And maybe that's the most important part, because even though his life didn't follow a perfect path, what he created still did. And that's why his story doesn't end with loss. It continues every time someone hears those songs and feels that same energy he once carried onto the stage. A reminder that behind every bright spotlight, there's always a human story. Complex, fragile, and impossible to fully understand unless you look at everything, not just the parts that shine. And when you look at everything that came after his passing, something even more interesting begins to appear. Not just the story of Brian Connolly himself, but the way his absence reshaped everything around him. Because sometimes, the real impact of a person isn't fully understood while they're present. It becomes clearer only after they're gone, when the system they were part of has to continue without them. After Brian left Sweet in 1978, the band didn't immediately collapse. They continued, released music, performed, adapted. On paper, everything still existed. But if you analyze it closely, something fundamental has shifted. The energy was different. The identity wasn't as clear. Because while bands are made of multiple people, there's often one central element that holds everything together. And for Sweet, that element had always been Brian's voice and presence. When that element disappears, the structure doesn't instantly fall apart, but it no longer functions the same way. That's why even years later, when people talk about Sweet, they almost always refer back to the Connolly era. Not just because it was successful, but because it felt complete, balanced, like all variables were aligned at the same time. And that idea of alignment is important, Because Brian's life, in many ways, can be understood as a series of moments where things aligned perfectly, followed by moments where they didn't. Early on, everything came together. The right band, the right songwriters, the right time in music history. Glam rock itself was rising, and Sweet fit into that movement perfectly. Their image, their sound, their energy, it all connected with a generation that wanted something louder, brighter, more expressive. But albums like Sweet Fanny Adams showed what they were really capable of. But just as things were shifting creatively, everything changed physically. The attack. A single night, a single moment, and everything that defined him, his voice, was permanently damaged. Think about that. For a singer, your voice isn't just a tool, it's your entire system, your identity, your connection to everything you've built. And suddenly, it wasn't the same anymore. The band tried to continue, adjusting roles, sharing vocals, moving